Good day, everyone. This is Surya, and I'm from Document 360 team, and I'm the co-organizer of this session tonight. And we are thrilled to have you all amongst us in this webinar. Take the pleasure of introducing the speaker for the day to all of you. So, Giddy, as he's fondly known, is an American technical writer and instructional designer with rich experience in Android application development and documenting software and hardware for Israel-based high-tech companies. So he has designed and implemented documentation content strategies and portals keeping user experience in mind. He works with companies to implement a winning documentation strategy that reduces support tickets and promotes their product. So in his current role at SafeBreach, Giddy has analyzed and identified customer friction points basis which he defined a strategy to fix these by documentation and training. He laid out a process for managing documentation tasks across the team and successfully migrated all legacy documentations to a new innovative documentation platform. So with these few words, I now pass on the screen to Giri to start his presentation. The floor is all yours, Gideon.
Thank you. Hey, everybody. So yeah, the presentation or webinar is called, transform your docs with data analytics. So who am I? So I'm Giddy, as he just mentioned. I'm the head of product knowledge and training at SafeBreach. I'm an American from Ohio originally, but I have some degrees, so I'm kind of all over the world anymore. So I'm an American who studied in England, and also I'm currently living in Israel. And along the way, given my useless liberal arts degrees, I also did some courses in full stack web design and Android app development to kind of boost my technical knowledge. And I also attached my LinkedIn address, so it's Gideon Berensmeyer. So in case any of you guys have any questions or you want to connect, feel free to do it. I'm very responsive. So for this webinar has about 5 sections. So in part 1, I'll give an overview of what data metrics are and why you should even care about them. So there are benefits for your company as well as yourself within the company. Part 2, I'll talk about what I think the most common mistakes are in data and documentation data analytics and how to identify your real KPIs. So there is a difference between documentation data metrics and KPIs. And so I'll talk about that mistake. In part 3, I'll go through how I use the data with my documentation. So this is kind of where I give an answer, how to use data analytics in your documentation. So the catch is, I focus less on documentation metrics and more on business KPIs. And then in part 4, I'll discuss how to measure your KPIs and show your value to the company. So unless, of course, you're failing, in which case you need to hide those, the data analytics, but we'll assume that you'll succeed. So. And then at the end, we'll have the Q&A session, for questions. So the first section is, how data plays a pivotal role in documentation. So let me just, I have multiple screens here. So data-driven documentation improves the customer experience. It drives business goals and increases the importance increases your importance within the company. So these are all kind of fluffy, very generic kind of statements. So what does this actually mean? So I addressed like 4 KPIs where the analytics can be important. So 1, you can reduce your support tickets, fairly intuitive. Reduce onboarding time, which is the amount of time it takes to get your customers onboarded and using your product. You can increase your product stickiness. So that's how often new features are being used, how much they're being used, if they're being used at all. And then you can also drive SEO. In some cases, if you have public documentation. So there are 2 ways of kind of incorporating data analytics into your documentation. One is on the micro level, which is kind of the decisions that how you define your articles, what words and terminology you're using, the structure of the articles. I'm actually less interested in that and more on the macro level sort of things. So how to improve your customer experience. So in this webinar, I won't go through how to write your articles, but more about how to improve the customer experience with content. So by improving the customer experience through measurable KPIs, we can have an impact on the business and justify like our existence within the company. So especially, we're entering or perhaps we're already in the midst of a recession here. And technical writers, we're often the last people who get hired and then the first people who get fired. And so we need to within our companies, we have to justify our existence, especially with the current situation. So I'll give you some ideas on how to do that. So there are 2 types of data metrics, quantitative and qualitative. So in general, the difference between quantitative data and qualitative data is the quantitative can be counted, measured, expressed in numbers, whereas qualitative data is more descriptive and more conceptual. So the quantitative data answers the question like how many or how much, whereas qualitative data will answer the question of how or why. So what really differentiates the two, at least in my view, is their disadvantages or weaknesses. So while quantitative is easily measured, it can also be inconclusive. So let's say I have some numeric data here, maybe time on page or something like that. I can't necessarily tell what to do with that information. Maybe time on page indicates that the page is really long, but maybe it's also indicating that the page and the topic is very complicated. Whereas qualitative information is a lot harder to get. You have to collect the information, you have to really dig for it. And the problem with it is it can also be skewed. So you might have 3 really experienced customers who you speak to and they say, the documentation's great. But then you have your support guys who are saying, no, the documentation's horrible, it's not working, we're getting lots of complaints. So yeah, there are advantages and disadvantages to both. But to sum up for our purposes, like, what differentiates them is, how we collect them, what actions we can derive from them, and then the ease of collecting accurate information. So quantitative, again, so the quantitative part, so this is, this I took from documentation, or Document 360. They have a lot of pages dedicated to analytics. So so quantitative data includes the numeric metrics, so like Google Analytics and things like that. So page views, bounce rate, time on page, landing pages, clicks, impressions, click-through rate. Again, these are very easily obtainable, but they're less actionable. So you can't really necessarily have any gain any insights from them. The qualitative part, this is so we can think of here. This is also again from Document 360. This is their feedback manager. So here we can think of engagement metrics. So like feedback from comments, community posts, support tickets, the like and dislike buttons, feature requests, customer interviews, keywords. Like the catch here is, while it is more actionable, like the customer will come to you, he'll say, what is wrong with the documentation. You can get a very skewed view. So one customer might think that the documentation is great, the other might think it's horrible. And so it's very easy to to see these actionable insights, but then get the wrong impression from them. So here's where I want to discuss how to identify and interpret your actual KPIs. So data needs context. So if you go on the internet and again, I tried this again last night and I Googled, just to make sure I'm still right here. I Googled documentation KPIs or documentation metrics or documentation analytics. They all lead to the same kind of pages. So you'll see tons of blogs, webinars, and lectures, and they'll talk about metrics and collecting feedback. But one of the most important and fundamental things that they all miss is the order and how you should handle this. So like you can't just look at your pages with the, like you can go into Google Analytics or Document 360 and you see the highest time on pages and assume that you need to cut them down, or that the pages with the highest bounce rates need to be redone. Like an example would be release notes. Release notes typically have a very, very high bounce rate. But why is that? Customers are going in, they're looking at the release notes, seeing what's new, and then they leave. They don't necessarily care to read the rest of the documentation. So the bounce rate doesn't necessarily indicate that there's something wrong with the page. It just, it's reflecting the user experience. The same about the geolocation. So, I was working at a company where 92% of our users were from US or English-speaking countries. 7% were from France, and then we had 2 customers out of 1,000 plus who were Japanese. And so, instinctively, you would think that if you're going to do translation, you would be focused on the French-speaking countries. But actually, what happened was, with that, with the context in mind, we actually translated to Japanese, because the Japanese, the levels of English there are a lot lower than they are in France. So our French customers were perfectly fine reading the English content, whereas the Japanese couldn't use it at all. And also the Japanese customers paid a lot more money, so we had to focus on that. So you need to start with questions, not with the data. So data metrics should support your documentation decisions and justify them, but don't assume that just because you have page views or likes, dislikes, you have to do something with it. And so I have a good example here. So this is going back to my my early days as a technical writer in my first job. So we were just leaving the PDFs and the old book styles and moving to online documentation. And so, this was my very first job. I was very excited. And I was also taking a web design course. And so I ran and I added Google Analytics to all of our online documentation pages. And so, what did I see? I saw, wow, these pages have a high time on page. And so I said to myself, wow, this must indicate that there's something wrong with the page, that there's too much involved, that, I need to reduce the amount of words there. And I ended up, making mistakes because I wrongly assumed that, time on page meant, it's too complicated. And so as you see here, this is kind of a lame example, but, I started cutting out words that might have been really crucial to the meaning and understanding of the documentation. So we have tons of metrics, but that doesn't mean we can do anything with it. And this is typically the problem we have. And so again, if you go onto blogs and that and read, what people are doing with analytics, it's hard to get concrete ideas what you should do with them. So here's where I want to explain how to get the context. And so going to get the context, we need to answer the fundamental question which is what is it that we do as technical writers or documentarians or however you want to define us. So there have been a lot of layoffs recently, and again, we're entering or are already in part of a recession here. So if your boss comes to you and he's doing a performance review and he's about to lay off people and he asks you, what is it that you do here? What benefit do you give to the company? Your response can't be, I reduced the time of reading on 50 pages. Like, you'll be unemployed fairly quickly. And I think this is the mistake that a lot of us are making when we try to use documentation metrics. We misidentify the real KPIs. The KPIs aren't the time on page or the bounce rate or things like that. There are actually our business KPIs. And so to understand this, I want to walk through the typical user journey. So when a user is coming to our site or whatever it is, we start with awareness, which is we have a potential customer. They're sort of interested. So I'm currently working at SafeBreach. So let's take SafeBreach as an example. So we have a customer who's come to our site, safebreach.com, and they're looking around. They're trying to figure out if the product's relevant for them. Next, we have a consideration, which is it probably is relevant for them. So we're converting them into a potential lead. So your company may have like SDRs or EDRs or BDRs, however they're called, but they usually qualify these people and turn them into a sales opportunity. Then the next stage is, the purchase stage, which is the lead becomes and converts into an actual customer. The next we have onboarding, which is, they sign the contract, they have the product, they have access to it, they need to onboard and deploy the product, however, whatever the onboarding process is. And then ongoing, we have retention, which is, the customer is using it, so we have support, are they using new features, things like that. And this is kind of the typical user journey. So if we convert this user journey into KPIs, the business KPIs, we can, and there are more KPIs than just this, but these are some common ones here. So if we convert these into KPIs, so we have traffic. So number one, so your marketing team's KPIs are using search words to drive traffic and create a sales pipeline. The next is qualification. So the pre-sales or SDRs, they're trying to identify and qualify these potential customers into leads. Sales, their job is to sign the customer and convert the leads to a sales or to an actual sale. CS and onboarding. So this is, we want to onboard the customers as quickly and as smoothly as possible. And then the support is the technical support and maybe the CS team who's, responsible for taking care of the customers, on an ongoing basis. And so these are kind of the common KPIs that your business is concerned about, and these can be actually measured. Whereas like the time on page might seem like a KPI you want to reduce, it's not. And documentation satisfaction, it is a KPI, but it's something that kind of falls under the customer success or CSAT scores, I think is what most companies call them. So developing a documentation strategy. So in my current role at SafeBreach, I developed a strategy around this process. So I have 6 steps that I implemented here. So the first is defining your KPIs. Then I'll walk through each of these. The second step is collecting data. The next one is establishing a baseline, and then the fourth is analyzing the results. And then you want to implement the changes, and then continuous review. So so I talked about the theoretical and kind of the, the cloudy ideas around analytics. I want to actually leave you guys with some tangible steps, because, again, I've read the blogs, I've seen the lectures, I've seen the webinars, and it's really hard to get concrete steps on what to do with business analytics, or documentation analytics and business KPIs. So starting with the first one here, so defining your KPIs. So in order to establish our KPIs, like the examples that I listed earlier, we need to speak to people in the company and get this info. It's not something, we can go into Google Analytics or Document 360 or some sort of feedback flow. You need to identify the stakeholders along the customer journey that I identified and speak to each one of them and find out what their business KPIs are. So you need to email, Slack, Zoom, whatever you need to, to go to marketing or find out how potential customers are using the content within the company and map out their entire journey. And so, as you speak to your stakeholders within the company, they might not be used to talking to a technical writer here. We're fairly low on the totem pole here. So they might not understand why you need documentation or how you can help, but you need to explain that, you're interested in their KPI and their KPIs, and then how you can use your content or even create new forms of content to help them reduce their KPIs. So an example would be onboarding. So the CS team is interested in onboarding new customers. Their KPI is, maybe reducing the amount of time, and that's where we can create content and try to help them out there. So the first step is defining the KPIs. You can't do this yourself. You actually need to go and speak to the stakeholders in the company and get their KPIs. Next is collecting data. So I mentioned earlier that there are two types of data. You have qualitative and quantitative, and you need to kind of take both into account because they both have their advantages and disadvantages. You can't just rely on one of them. And so you can combine the data. You have to speak to, again, you have to speak to the stakeholders. We have our documentation analytics and Document 360 or whatever tool you're using, but the marketing team, the sales team, the support team, they all have their own programs that they're using. So you need to speak to them again and find out what their KPIs are and how they're measured, and then see what levels that they're at. The nice thing about this is that as you go along, and this is something I've noticed along my own 10+ year career, is the more you speak to these people, the more they become aware of the technical writer and the documentation, and your role kind of expands. It's not just writing KB articles in the corner of the office here. You're now actively becoming part of the business. And politically, this really helps. So the next is establishing a baseline. So we've collected all the data. We can say on January 1st, from day one, we've established a baseline. So let's say the support team's getting 100 tickets a month. They have 5 support agents. It takes them 5 days to close the tickets. That's one baseline. New customers take 6 weeks to onboard, and maybe it takes 4 meetings with your account managers to onboard them. That's another metric, another baseline. Your release notes could be viewed 60% of the time, and then let's say new features are only used or implemented about 10% of the time by, let's say, 2% of the customers. Once we've established these, you can then verify them with your stakeholders. And again, establishing a baseline is pretty easy at this point. You can do it through email or Slack or whatever, but you need to establish a baseline so you can measure whether you're succeeding with your documentation. Next, and this is the most complicated step, of course, is implementing changes. So you've defined the KPIs, you've collected them, you've established baselines. Now you need to implement the change, and this is kind of how you transform your documentation. So if I'll just make up some examples here. So let's say marketing here, for example, they have their traffic KPI, which is, they want to bring traffic into the website using certain words. So you could speak to them and find out which keywords they're using. At one company I was working at, which had a public knowledge base, we actually had 2 customers come in through the documentation site using, they got to us through a random article that was very generic. It wasn't even about the product. But as they came through the site, through the documentation, they eventually converted into paying customers. And so, I was able to prove my value to the company by, I mean, it's a weak argument, but I was, more than happy to promote myself. So, so they came in through the documentation site, through these keywords, and then they eventually converted into a customer. And so, you can speak to the marketing team, find out, which keywords they're using, and try to implement or add those keywords to meta tags or headlines, whatever, in your articles. Next, if we take sales, their KPI is conversion, so how many leads they're converting. So you can find out what the sales flow is for customers. Sometimes they have RFPs that some technical writers fill out, so you can find out which RFPs are working. We could, let's say, another way would be maybe you find out that customers convert more if they're using your demo environment. So you could create a demo environment that has tutorials that you design and create that show a quick time to value using very specific and common flows. So again, this isn't typical documentation with just knowledge base. You can actually go beyond that and make more content, such as videos or walkthroughs in demo environments, and try to show how you converted new customers or potential leads into customers. Onboarding. So I've mentioned this several times, and this is something I've done in my current position. One of the things we did was we spoke to CS and we reviewed gongs, which were recordings of onboarding sessions. And we noticed that a lot of customers were asking the same questions, or they were even coming completely unprepared, like they didn't really even know what our product did. And so as a result of that, we found that it was taking a lot longer to onboard customers. And so what we did was we created an onboarding package to reduce the amount of time. So we created a package with deployment videos and with knowledge base articles, and then we send those to new customers. And so we found that we automated a lot of the sessions, the one-on-one sessions that our account managers were having with customers, and we converted that into an onboarding package. And then we were able to reduce the amount of time it took to onboard new customers, and also the amount of time that account managers were spending with customers by educating them before they even spoke to us. So if on day one, a customer knew nothing about our product, we send them an onboarding package and we say, we'll meet with you next week. By the time they got to that first week, they already had the basics of what the product did. And so we could take the conversation a lot further, and we could onboard them faster. And again, it reduced the discussions that we had to have with customers. And so, when you go to your manager and he asks you what value do you bring to the company, you can say, you can actually point to something measurable here and say, we reduced the amount of time it took to onboard. Next, we have support tickets. So this is fairly self-explanatory, and this is something pretty common to technical writers. So, we can measure how many tickets do we have, and how long does it take to solve a ticket, how many interactions does it take. So you can speak to your support team, you can identify how many tickets they're getting a month, how long it's taking to close, and how many interactions, and you can reduce that through things like the document 360 ticket defector, for example, or some sort of like pop-ups that when they're in the documentation, or maybe the opening a ticket request flow. You can hit them with documentation or some sort of knowledge-based bots to try to help them out before they even before they finalize opening a ticket. So after you've implemented these changes, the next thing you need to do is analyze your results. So again, you need to periodically go back to your stakeholders, find out how you're doing, get the numbers from them, whatever systems they're using. Support teams, they use Zendesk, they use Wix, they use Salesforce. Find out how many tickets are being reduced, the onboarding time. Speak to your CS team and see how long does it take to onboard a customer now, how many sessions is it taking. Your documentation satisfaction, this could be included in the CSAT scores. So you can ask your customer service manager to add a section in the customer satisfaction surveys related specifically to documentation. So are you using the documentation? Are you satisfied by the documentation? Are you able to complete your tasks with the documentation? And so the one thing I would emphasize though about analyzing these results is over communicate what you're doing, politically. So if you have Slack channels here, say we analyzed the results, we saw a reduction in the amount of time it took to onboard customers since we implemented the onboarding package. We saw that the time it takes to answer tickets, support tickets, also dropped by several days. Again, you want to oversell yourself, so we can show value to the company. Next, and then this is kind of the last step, is the continual review here. So continuous review. So this is going to depend on your company here. So after you've established a baseline, you need to check in periodically, once a quarter, or once twice a year. The cadence is up to you to define. I don't really have any strict policy or ideas on how to do this. It depends on your company, how large the company is. Startups, it's fairly easy to get this information, whereas a large enterprise, there's a lot more bureaucracy involved. But again, if you, as you review, you can show the amount of value you're adding to the company. You can, justify your existence, and maybe, if you're really lucky, expand your department. But so the last step again is, to just continuously review and implement more changes. So then this takes us to calculating the value of your documentation. So again, this is kind of tricky. So it takes a bit of estimation on your part, but you need to, like if you see an increase in ticket traffic or sales conversion, through your content, reduction on onboarding time, or reduction in tickets, increase in feature usage, or you can calculate this value in terms of like the number of hours or employees that you've essentially replaced. So let's take an example, like your customers, your support team receives 100 tickets a month. They have 5 agents, and they can handle 20 tickets. You reduce the amount of tickets, incoming tickets, to 80, and now agents can handle 25 tickets, and it takes them, 3 days or whatever to close a ticket. You basically now need like 3.5 agents, whereas previously, before your content changes, you needed 5. And so onboarding, again, onboarding took 6 weeks and 4 meetings. You create an onboarding package with videos and learning paths and documents for that. So you reduced it to 3 weeks and only 2 meetings. So you can actually show tangible value through your documentation in the amount of hours you saved employees, or the amount of employees you've reduced. So again, it's not enough, when your boss comes to you and for a performance review and says, hey, what have you done recently? It's not enough to just say, I reduced the time on page. You need to focus on the business KPIs, and that's where documentation can have a measurable impact. It's a measurable impact because it's one that it affects the bottom line of the company. So in summary here, to summarize everything here, so don't confuse documentation metrics with KPIs. They're not exactly the same thing. They're not, I'm not saying documentation metrics are useless. They do add value. They can support some decisions, but they're not the business KPIs. You should focus on the business KPIs because that's what affects the bottom line, and that's what justifies your existence. Next is, data needs context. So, I gave several examples here. So you can't just blindly look at data, like I did as a junior technical writer, and assume that you see these numbers and it means something. You have to understand your business KPIs, and then maybe you can get some insights from your data metrics. And then also publicize your success. So again, recession, we need to justify our existence. So as you notice, you're making an impact on the business in terms of the number of hours or employees that you've reduced. Publicize this, spit it out in Slack channels, send company emails, try not to be too obvious about it, but publicize your success.
Thanks a lot, guys.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you all. Thank you, Gideon.